Şimdi Microsoft açık kaynak yazılım evrimini anlatmak üzere Microsoft Amerika Yazılım Birimi yöneticisi Stephen Walli'yi sahneye davet ediyorum alkışlarınızla.
Good morning, everybody. Do I have to pull a Donovan? Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me today. Unlike Donovan, I am not going to do kind of full contact demos on the fly. I'm going to tell stories today. And it's the story of how Microsoft has evolved and is continuing to evolve its open source culture. And it's interesting because I was there when this started, and I was actually there a little beforehand. And so Microsoft has gone from a company that, when our CEO was Steve Ballmer, 15 years ago, 16 years ago, he said, Linux is a cancer. I suspect what he meant is Linux is a virus, because that's what he was worried about, but that it was somehow going to destroy intellectual property. And so how did we get from there to now? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. This is a statement that most people in America hear regularly. They attribute it to Peter Drucker. If you consult the internets, it's probably not Peter Drucker. But the reality is that it's true. And so one of the interesting things about my current job, I've just come back to Microsoft after 13 years away, and I now work in Azure. And everybody keeps saying, so what's our open source strategy? And what I want to convince you of with these stories is we are not building an open source strategy. What we're building is an open source culture. I always hate seeing my picture that big on stage, so I'm rather uniquely qualified to tell some of these stories. I've been around the open source community for almost 30 years now, back before we called it open source. For us, it was just you collaborated on software, and we've shared software since we've written software all the way back to 1950, because writing good software is hard work. But in 1980, they added copyright law, and I started work in 1980. That's how much gray hair I have. And so we had to figure out licensing experiments for the next 20 years. How do we keep collaborating on software? How do we keep sharing software? And then 20 years ago, we came up with the open source definition. It was interesting because what I was building in those days, back in the 90s, is what is the easiest way to describe it is it was a Berkeley distro on the NT kernel. Windows NT was a brand new operating system. It ran on DEC Alpha, MIPS, and Intel, and it was going to take over the world. And I'd just come out of a Unix experience doing the Unix standardization work, and some friends and I started a company to bring Unix to this new place. And of course, we started with BSD, because 4.4 BSD Lite was what AT&T's lawyers said we could use. That was the thing that, we were already kind of careful with IP. And we ran the company for 4 years. We did not make it. But at the end of that time, Microsoft acquired the assets of the company because we'd been doing this with a Microsoft license the whole time. And it was interesting because we were juggling all of this technology. Our product was 250, 300 packages of software off of the internet. It was covered by 25 or 30 licenses. And some of those licenses still aren't approved by the OSI. And then there was the Microsoft license, and then we wrapped it all up in our own end-user license agreement, and this was the experience we were providing to our customers. But to us, building a product out of open source projects was natural. It's what you do. And so that was kind of an interesting experience to then come into the open source arguments and debates about, what is free software, what is open source, what's better, and to then be now, then working for Microsoft at the height of the fear around Linux of what is this Linux thing? Do we need to worry about it? And so I stayed with my project and the products that we were building for 2 years. And even coming into Microsoft, it was fascinating because you have to do the legal due diligence. And they said, okay, where does your source code come from? And we had millions of lines of source code from all of these other places. And we had GPL code in there. So yes, I am the first person to ship GPL code in a product from Microsoft. But that's not where they think the history started. The other thing that I worked on at Microsoft was a project called Rotor. And Rotor was the first attempt we made at building a community around .NET at the source code level. So we took a cut through the base class libraries, the common language runtime, and the C# compiler, and we made sure that it ran on FreeBSD, because we were not allowed to say the L word back then, as well as Mac OS and Windows. But it was not open source. It was very carefully and deliberately not open source. And after that, that was a year-long project, and we demonstrated that this was all possible. And a lot of people used that to understand how .NET did what it did. And then the next thing we did is, my last 2 years, the first time I worked for Microsoft, was very much, I was part of the Windows Business Management team. And my job, just to demonstrate I really don't know how to run my career, it was to help Microsoft think through what are the experiments that we could do to engage with this growing open source community. What are the things that will make it right, so to speak, for Microsoft? And one of the last things that I did while I was still there the first time, I have no idea why that didn't come up. There we go. Was a project, this is where Microsoft starts its timeline. In 2004, there was a project called Wix. Wix is the Windows Installer XML. And what it was Rob Mensching was a developer who created a tool set that allowed you to easily script your way to a Windows installer. All the other tools that existed at the time, they were GUI-based, which doesn't really help you build an installer that you want to put in your version control system. Most of them were awkward, they were expensive, and Rob had this great toolkit that was all command line driven and recipe driven. And so he wanted to do an open source project with it. And he wanted to share it. Because that's what we do as developers, right? We share software. And he was my first experiment. So I ran interference for all of the lawyers and for all of the executives, and it took weeks and months of discussion. And we finally kicked out this first open source project for Microsoft. And it was very significant because not only was it the first, but Rob published all of the source code on SourceForge, which for those of you that aren't that old, it was GitHub before there was GitHub. And we did it with the IBM's Common Public License, so what was being used with Eclipse back in those days. So again, this was significant because people were kind of stunned that Microsoft would do this incredibly proprietary company. So I want to build some context for these stories. We live in a world of science fiction. For the longest time in human history, through the whole agricultural revolution, it was 5,000 years long. That's how archaeologists think of the agricultural revolution. You could pick somebody up from 5,000 years ago and drop them 3,000 years ago, and they would still understand the technology in front of them. They'd still understand the tool sets. In planting crops, the only thing that would really change is if you drop them in a different geographical region, the crop mix might be different. But things didn't really change for a long time. And at the end of that period, we ended up at the end of the Middle Ages, we ended up into the Renaissance, we end up into the Industrial Revolution, and then the Information Revolution, and now we're living in a world where all of this technology up here, that's the last 10 years. And it's accelerating even faster and faster. When I started in 1980, you kind of had a very narrow tool choice. Yeah, you picked an operating system, you picked a language, and you'd lived there for a long period of time. Even when you got into the 1990s, you were probably a C++ developer, maybe a new Java developer, because Java was the new thing, and that meant you were living on Unix servers. Or you probably worked in Visual Basic and you lived in a Microsoft world. And that evolved into .NET. But even as little as 15 years ago, there were not that many choices. Whereas now, the average developer, you're a polyglot developer. You use the language and the tool set that's right for the job in front of you. If you're doing machine learning things, you're probably working in Python with some of the Python toolkits that are there. Java is still very much an evolving language. The Java runtime underneath continues to evolve and support new language paradigms. If you're doing heavy mathematical data science work, you're probably working in R. So most people are polyglot developers now. And as you step into the space, the way you deploy is differently now too. When Donovan was talking earlier today, it really was, kind of you and a sledgehammer, and you went into the machine room and you got it up and running. You were responsible for that entire pipeline. Now there's teams of people in place, and are you dropping it onto Linux machines, or are you dropping it onto Windows machines? Well, now you have a cloud, you could do both. Once you step into containers and containerized workloads, then you can start to even choose how you want to orchestrate those containers. So the world we live in today is dramatically different, and it's accelerating. The next thing that we're all being asked to think about is serverless. How do you do serverless? And while we didn't have the word DevOps 10 years ago, serverless is a brand new term, and people are still trying to figure out what that means. I know what I'm doing now. I'm hitting the wrong button. I'm not good with hardware, just so everybody understands. I went into software for a reason. So I want to talk about the journey, but I don't want to take you through kind of a boring litany of, and then we did this, and then we did that. What I want to do is I want to kind of start the discussion around 4 projects to demonstrate the different ways that Microsoft began to think about this problem. So the first thing is, let's talk about our Linux investments. 10 years ago, Hyper-V was continuing to evolve. And we realized that if you're going to do server consolidation on Hyper-V, oddly enough, people wanted to do more than just Windows. So if you're going to do server consolidation, you're going to have to support this Linux thing. And it wasn't long after we started working in the Linux community to actually get the Hyper-V changes and drivers in, well, GPUs started to become a thing. And so we needed to get our GPU drivers for Linux into that community. And then, we've continued to evolve our practices and such to now, Donovan showed you this morning the fact that he was running PowerShell on Linux, PowerShell on Mac. It was, we continue to open up our Linux evolution by bringing all of these technologies that were people thought of as traditional Microsoft-centric, .NET-centric, Windows-centric technologies to Linux. And all of these things now run on multiple platforms. As you continue to work with your customers, well, you start to find out that, customers are difficult things. Customers want to do all kinds of things. They want to use all kinds of software. And so the next thing we ran into is customers that wanted to then do database-related things on Linux. Well, there's a number of ways we can do this in the Azure world. You could run your MySQL database or your Postgres database in a VM and make that part of the application deployment that you're doing. And then you're responsible for all of the management and backups and all of the rest of patching and all the good things that go with managing your own database environment, and that becomes difficult. And the other thing we thought, well, we've ported SQL Server to Linux, so we'll offer SQL Server as a managed service. Well, we can do that. But oddly enough, our customers that have been living in a Linux world for a very long time, they were MySQL and Postgres customers, and they weren't really interested in our managed SQL Server offering. So we then went into the MySQL and Postgres communities, and we began to work and integrate that experience into Azure as well. So we've now taken a step from merely contributing and making things available. Now we're into the space where we're actually having to integrate and build product and service around this. Have people heard of TypeScript? Can I have a show of hands? TypeScript? That's a fabulous number of people. Thank you. TypeScript's really interesting. Anders Heilsberg is a very valued developer at Microsoft and has been for a long time. He was the inventor of the C# language. Before that, he created Turbo Pascal. And when the time came a number of years ago for him to do TypeScript, which is a type-safe system on top of JavaScript, He wanted to do this as open source. You know, the time was right. It was 4 years ago. And so he started this project on GitHub, full transparency, accepting changes from the first day. And so, you know, you too can send a pull request, and Anders will review it, and he might accept it, he might send back changes to you, you'll have a transparent discussion, and you too can affect TypeScript. But Anders is now at the point where he wouldn't think of doing language development any other way. He feels that TypeScript is an infinitely better language because of the way it's been built. He's had active feedback from customers the whole time. He's had active feedback and active contribution from language people in the academic world. So that there's a constant flow of ideas coming into TypeScript that just make it better, and he really wouldn't do it any differently. So he's been, you know, you can look at the GitHub drafts, he's been a primary contributor for a long time now, but it's a very open community. So Microsoft has taken that step into, well, how do we build our own communities and not integrate with other ones? Some people still want to challenge us on, yeah, but are you doing mission-critical things? Well, yes, we do. Sonic, that's our top-of-rack switches. Oddly enough, there's not a lot of top-of-rack switch software in Nix that's based on Windows. The reality is a lot of it is BSD-based, but Sonic is Microsoft's project for how we do the software-defined networking in our Nix at the top of rack. And it's a GitHub project. We've been basically, again, doing this in public, working with people that ship switches constantly in public. And this is mission-critical software. Not all of our switches are running Sonic yet, but that's certainly the growth, and we've almost swapped all the old switches out now. So a lot of the projects on that timeline kind of fall into these kinds of buckets. Microsoft is trying to enable customers with open source and build the business that way. That's things like all of our original Linux investments. We end up in a space where we're trying to integrate open source projects into our product offerings for customers, because again, that's what customers want us to do. We've ended up releasing software, so things like TypeScript, where this is a project that is a pure Microsoft, started from fresh, let's go build in the public kind of project. And then there's things where we're actively contributing software and working with partners and vendors in an open community that's open source driven. So what changed? Well, actually, everything. The industry changed. I think Microsoft was caught at a period 20 years ago where you have to remember, the World Wide Web is really only 22, 23 years old now. So we were in a period where the desktop world that was Microsoft's bread and butter in their history was a highly proprietary place, as opposed to the Unix community that was evolving into the server space, where people were a little more used to sharing. Now, it was still a very proprietary space. AT&T crushed friends of mine who were running BSDI as a company in a lawsuit back in the early 90s. So people still cared about property, but it was just a different way of thinking about it. And so when the open source world changed, Microsoft quickly kind of fell back into this, well, we're a very successful software company, and we do things as a proprietary software company, so this must be the way we do things. And that other thing over there, we don't understand it. But at this point, Red Hat has been a public trading company for almost 20 years now. And it's a highly successful growing company, and has been for 20 years now. You know, they survived the bust of the internet bubble. They survived the financial collapse in 2008. They're a well-run company focused on customer success, and they're one of probably the most successful open source companies that we've seen. And I think that's, you know, I can talk to you offline about that, why I think they're that successful. Our customers changed as well. If you had a discussion with a CIO 10 years ago, they would tell you, we don't have a lot of open source, or they'd still say, no, we have no open source in our shop. Now, they were wrong. They'd had open source in their shop ever since they had a data center. But they hadn't thought about it yet. They hadn't done the survey. They didn't realize that most of their operations people were using open source tools constantly and had been for decades. But at this point, if you have a discussion with a CIO, CIOs understand now that these open source tool sets are fundamentally important. And so our customers actually know how to talk to us about their needs in an open source way. Not only that, open source is now driving the digital transformation that the average CIO knows they need to be part of. And it's not just in the containers and serverless space. If you're doing anything in machine learning or data science based, all of that work is coming out of open source based toolkits. And it's all of the companies that are even engaged in that space, including companies the size of Google and Microsoft and AWS, are all doing all of the work in that space using open source toolkits and open source tools. So this is just the kind of the way we do things now in the industry. And Microsoft changed. We changed. Our demographics certainly changed. Microsoft as a company, when I started with them, they were 40,000 people in '99. There were 60,000 when I left 5 years later, sorry. There are 100,000 people now. And as you hire developers into this space, most developers use open source most of the time. Their languages and frameworks are all open source based. In fact, I don't think you can find a language that's not open source anymore. Certainly not a mainstream one. If they're a fresh graduate from university, of course they've been using open source tools at university. So the demographics of the people we hire have changed. Our leadership has changed. So we're on our third CEO, and Satya Nadella is a much more nuanced leader when it comes to having discussions around what customers want and how open source plays into that. And so our culture is changing. And again, that goes back to this idea that culture is what matters. And there's an old culture at Microsoft. It's deep in the bones of the company. We are a company, and always have been a company, since Bill Gates and Paul Allen created the company, that is a company by, of, and for developers. And this is something that all of the tools of the original company, they were basic programming tools for programmers. And then there was an operating system, and then there was more tools. It's always been about enabling developers to write more and better code. And at this point in history, developers love open source. Developers have always been people that like to take things apart. We're engineers, but instead of working with hardware, we work with software. We want to understand how that thing works. So you need access to the source code. Even the early experiment around Rotor, an enormous number of people downloaded Rotor that weren't academic researchers trying to build on the Common Language Runtime. They were just .NET developers that wanted to see how the base class library did things. So developers like to learn, and the way you learn is by reading more software and tinkering with that software until you get better and better and better and you understand it. And so this is just fundamental to the kind of the fabric of the culture of development now. And as a company that's kind of developer-led, sooner or later Microsoft had to become an open source friendly company. And our current CEO is still very much a developer by history. If you present to Satya Nadella, you need to be prepared to have a developer's discussion. He's going to ask hard technical questions. He's going to want to understand that you understand the engineering of what you do. There was a CEO that was not a developer, but he was quite famous for articulating his support for developers on stage at least once. And so people, again, he might have been a businessman, but he at least understood that development culture is the company. As Satya took over the reins of the company, he wanted to make sure he set up a consistent message across the company. So what does every good CEO do? You write a book. But the interesting thing here, I enjoyed reading the book, but then I also enjoyed reading Bob Young's book, the original founder of Red Hat. I enjoyed reading Jim Whitehurst's book, who is the founder, or is the current CEO at Red Hat. But one of the things that is kind of very clear from the culture that Satya is building is this idea of being very customer-focused. It's boundaryless and globally minded in seeking solutions. It's another way to say we're going to tear down the silos. But he's doing that, and it's part of the way he believes the company has to run. And that is very different from the way the Windows organization ran historically and the Office organization ran historically. But he's also this idea of being very aware of what customers want to do. 10 years ago, they realized coming out of a particular customer meeting that Linux needs to become a first-person operating system on Azure. And they understood that this means this would be a profound cultural challenge. And it is. The cultural change that's gone on here is it's 15 years in the making, it's 20 years in the making. The last 10 years, though, have seen Microsoft under Satya's leadership, both within Azure and then for the whole company, doubling down on this idea that Linux is a first-person operating system on Azure. We also continue to evolve and learn about this idea of the power of community and the power of actually sharing. We've had to unlearn certain habits that were bad habits we picked up while we were making money in the 90s. When you look at the communities that Microsoft is building, the .NET open source journey has been phenomenal. Down in 2002, yes, we did this experiment with Rotor. Before that, there was the standards experiment in 2001 around the definition of C# and the base class library. But in 2008, under the leadership of Scott Guthrie, they actually open sourced ASP.NET, the web platform. And then 4 years ago, the .NET compiler platform was open sourced. And this time, it was a true open source project. It's been run on GitHub ever since. If you take a look at folks contributing, there's an enormous number of people that contribute in this environment. And the important thing here is more than half of the commits come in from outside. Between my 2 times working for Microsoft, I've always been in touch with the company. I did some consulting work when Sam Ramji was running the open source lab at Microsoft. And I used to tease Sam that giving money to the Apache Software Foundation and publishing a couple of licenses is not doing open source. And, steps were taken, and finally there were some contributions being made, and that's great. But you aren't really building an open source community until you're actually accepting contributions back. It's not enough to just publish the source out. I know that meets the letter of the open source definition. Here's a bucket of software with an open source license on it, and the license is approved by the OSI. But it's not until you actually start to collaborate in community that you're really doing open source. And this is, the response has been fascinating because all of the ARM support for the .NET Core community has been done by Samsung. Qualcomm and Intel, 2 companies that compete vigorously with one another, continue to contribute and work together in this community, ensuring that they're showing off the best advantages of their chipsets inside of .NET Core. So these are the kinds of competitive things where competitors actually end up working together, and this is a common thing. We see it all the time in the Linux community, so too in the .NET community at this point in history. I was very happy to see the number of people that know about Visual Studio Code. This was the next community that kind of shocked Microsoft and was a real way to start thinking differently about open source for Microsoft. The interesting thing over the last, not just the uptake and the heavy usage, but in surveys in the JavaScript community almost a year ago, it turns out that VS Code is the most popular editor for JavaScript development. And there was a recent Go language survey just a couple of months ago now, I believe, where it's also the most popular editor for Go programmers. And the interesting thing for Microsoft, that the takeaway for us was this idea that Microsoft could create an editor, and it was Eric Gama, who was one of the original folks that was doing the design pattern work. He works at Microsoft now. This experiment was, well, Visual Studio, open sourcing Visual Studio would have been difficult because Visual Studio has evolved over a very long period of time and accreted a whole lot of code to the point that if we published it, nobody'd be able to figure out what it did. Nobody'd be able to make a reasonable contribution. So Eric actually stepped out and they basically re-envisioned what would a new Visual Studio look like? What does a new editor look like? And that's what VS Code is. And it's written based on electron.js, which is a GitHub-based project. And so this is a completely new place. But when you look at all of these Go programmers saying it's their favorite editor, or these Visual Studio, these JavaScript developers saying it's their favorite editor, these are not traditional Microsoft people. Almost none of them are Windows developers. If you look at where the cloud things sit in sequence, Azure's way down the list. So these are developers we've never worked with before, we've never sold anything to, we've never participated in their communities before, but apparently we're now building a community with them around VS Code. And so that too is an important learning for Microsoft as we kind of continue to evolve this open source culture. And then there's our work in the Kubernetes community. Now this isn't one that we started. Brendan Burns, who is one of the creators of Kubernetes, now works at Microsoft. But we've continued to invest in this community, and this project is part of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which sits under the auspices of the Linux Foundation. And we bought Deus as a way to get a huge number of very good Kubernetes developers. And we've continued to support the Helm, Draft, and Brigade projects as they go back into the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and into the Kubernetes project. And so this is, again, a role where Microsoft is now getting comfortable participating as that kind of first person in a very large, commercially centered open source project with our partners and competitors. So we continue to see Microsoft's own way of thinking about community in open source as this thing we have to think about differently. It's so dramatically differently than the kind of broadcast-only communities we did 20 years ago under the Microsoft Developer Network. And then we can get kind of meta about it all. There's that idea of open source community of open source communities. Microsoft has an open source project office. So they worry about things like the patterns and practices, license things. If you've ever had to deal with contribution licensing agreements, that's some open source projects, because they choose to completely control the inbound chain of contributions, will require CLAs to be signed. So there's a lot of process and practice that the way you deal with this and make it easier for the developers in your company to actually get the job done and use open source is you create an open source project office. Microsoft has one as well. These are the fine folks that if Rob Mensching was going to do Wix today, he'd basically go to an internal website, fill out a form, and he'd have an approval that is mostly automated probably within a couple of hours. It would not require somebody like me hounding lawyers and arguing with executives for weeks and months. So it's that kind of tool chain. All of our work that we do in GitHub, one of the first things that very large companies like Microsoft, Intel, and Google have discovered working with GitHub is that GitHub was never meant to scale to a company that was going to show up with 10 or 12,000 developers. And so there's tool chain work that we've done with GitHub to continue to evolve that work. That comes through this office. And the latest thing that this office is working on is something called Clearly Defined. We were one of the founding partners of this. So one of the challenges that's coming in the open source community, and we've been you can see folks wrestling with it over the last 5 to 10 years, but it's becoming a more important challenge as open source becomes truly ubiquitous and truly used everywhere, is this idea of tracking the metadata. And that means, so all of these modules that come together into this thing over here, whether the thing is a product or a television set or an automobile. What are the licenses on all of those things? Are we honoring all of our obligations under those licenses? So that kind of metadata. Tracking the security filings against any of these things. You know, are we using the version that still has these critical Sev5 CVEs against it? So there's a wealth of metadata that's tracked out there, and there's a whole lot of companies are discovering this is not competitive advantage to track all of this stuff about all of these open source projects. So what should we do? I know, let's create an open source project, and that way we'll collect all of this data and actually work on it together so that we can all make use of it and gain the value of this kind of work. So that's been an interesting thing that was just announced as an open source initiative incubator project a few weeks ago. And then there's the learning that we've had in our partnerships. One of the most fun ones was the realization that Red Hat is a partner. Red Hat is not a competitor. Now, that was obviously not true 15 years ago. But Satya Nadella and Jim Whitehurst now realize that they can do more for customer success and shareholder value together than they can as competitors. And so the famous photo that you saw earlier in the deck of Satya up on stage with Microsoft Hearts Linux behind him. You know, an analyst in the industry said, you know, hell must have frozen over. And that is the attitude that's coming from that, because we were vigorous competitors for a very long time. But I work for a man named John Gossman. John is Microsoft's board member to the Linux Foundation. And the first meeting that he went to was a little over a year ago when Microsoft just joined. And he said, you know, he got a standing ovation when he came into the boardroom, followed by 4 hours of hell has frozen over jokes. And he said, you know, that's kind of funny the first hour, but then it gets kind of boring after a while. But it's this realization that we have an incredible opportunity working with Red Hat as a partner and working around these open source communities that we both care about. But we also have partnerships with a lot of companies. And between John and I, we work on most of these partnerships together with the respective product teams within Microsoft. And this is ongoing work as we continue to build out Azure services and make things available on Azure for customers. So this is just kind of the way we do business now. And again, this is, to a certain extent, it's just business as usual, right? You have an ISV program, you run all of your partnerships through the ISV program, but it's also fundamentally different because the nature of the software and the communities that are involved is fundamentally different. And that's, again, a way that Microsoft is continuing to evolve and look at these things differently than we did perhaps 15 or 20 years ago. The .NET Foundation is something that Microsoft started around the .NET Core open source community. And this, again, is a place where we continue to work with partners and competitors. You know, Google and Microsoft might compete around cloud sites. JetBrains is certainly a competitor for the Visual Studio IDE world. But we've discovered that, again, we can actually create an environment where we can collaborate around the things that we can agree on. And so that's very much the journey from a Microsoft-centered perspective. These are the things that we're continuing to learn how to do and continuing to improve at. This story is not over. Here's a couple dozen more open source projects that we're continuing to involve ourselves with. Xamarin came in with the acquisition. We've been fundamental contributors in the R language space. Project Olympus is an open compute project, and the open compute project is open source hardware. So Microsoft, as it builds out data centers, is starting to get involved in open hardware discussions now as well. One of the surprising things for folks is how popular Bash for Windows is. I find that a little bittersweet considering my history with the company and my history in the 90s. But it just means that I was ahead of the curve, right? But again, making this the tool sets available to developers that are the tool sets developers want to use. It's kind of fundamental to our DNA, and those happen to be open source tool sets now. And so the future. The world is going to keep changing. That's, the one thing we know is true, and it's going to continue to accelerate. And as a company that cares about developers, and developers care about open source, that means Microsoft's going to have to continue to change with it and take the things that we did very well and bring them into a more open source friendly and open source engaged world. Our open source skill set will continue to improve. I've had a number of people chase me, and John's running into the same kind of questions now, and so is Mark Rusinovich, the CTO for Azure. But what happens if Satya leaves? Is it all going to go back to the way it was? And I believe that the simple answer to that is no. Because the reality is this isn't about an open source strategy at Microsoft. This is about open source culture. And Microsoft's culture continues to evolve and become more firmly entrenched. Anders Hallsberg is never going to develop a language in a closed proprietary way again. He doesn't see the point. Our customers are continuing to drive us along this journey and force us to think about these things different. And so it's not a reversible thing. If Satya left tomorrow and Steve Ballmer came back, he'd have to learn how to say open source in Linux. That's kind of fun. But don't trust me. Watch our actions. Watch us continue to participate in this bigger and bolder world. That's what I'd like you to take away from this, is that we are learning and we are getting good at this. And we are building fundamentally important communities, and we're also contributing in the communities around us that already exist. So I'd like you to continue to judge us on our actions. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time today. I'm going to be around for the rest of the day, so I am happy to answer questions, and we'll go from there later. Thank you very much.